The reflection in the polished mahogany of the boardroom table was a cruel mirror. It showed Leo Vance, not as the master of the universe he projected on his social media, but as a cornered animal, his tailored suit suddenly feeling like a cage. Opposite him, his father, Arthur, sat with a stillness that was both infuriating and unnerving. Arthur's hands rested on his knees, palms down, a gesture of unnerving placidity. He hadn't spoken in 10 minutes. He just listened, his gaze fixed on the middle distance, as if observing a poorly rehearsed play. The lead counsel for Sterling Fiduciary Bank, a man named Henderson whose smile was as sharp and predatory as a shark's, droned on, his voice a low hum of legalistic threats. "So to be clear, Mr. Vance," Henderson said, his gaze flicking condescendingly toward Arthur, "the liability on this $770,000 note is joint. While the primary occupant of the property was your son, your signature, your pristine financial history, was the bedrock of this agreement. A bedrock that has, it seems, crumbled into sand." Leo finally snapped. The pressure had been building, a physical force in his chest, and it erupted. "How could you let this happen?" he hissed across the table, his voice a venomous whisper meant only for his father, but loud enough for everyone to hear the tremor of panic. "This was supposed to be easy. Your credit, your name, it was perfect. You said nothing. You did nothing. Now we're losing everything because you couldn't even manage your own finances." The injustice of the accusation hung in the air, thick and toxic. Arthur, the man whose name was the only reason this meeting was even happening, was being flayed by the very son who had stolen that name, who had forged it, who had leveraged a lifetime of integrity for a glass house on a hill he couldn't afford. Arthur's expression did not change. His gaze did not waver. He simply absorbed the blow, another in a long line of them, his silence a profound and terrifying counterpoint to his son's frantic desperation. To Henderson and his junior associates, this was just another sad family drama playing out in the sterile theater of corporate law. They saw a flashy, entitled young man and his doddering, silent father, two fools who had flown too close to the sun. To them, Arthur Vance was just a name on a defaulted loan, a relic from a bygone era, a liability to be disposed of as efficiently as possible. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that the quiet old man sitting before them was not a relic. He was a monument, and they were about to learn a lesson in humility, a lesson written not in the dry ink of their legal documents, but in the indelible script of a forgotten legacy. The narrator's voice swells with a quiet, dramatic power, a promise of the revelation to come. Welcome to Moral Compass Stories, where we delve into the moments that test our character and reveal the silent strength that lies hidden within the most unassuming souls. If you believe that honor is not a relic of the past but a living, breathing force, then make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have clicked the notification bell. You are about to witness a reckoning, a quiet storm of justice, and you will not want to miss a single, transformative moment of what is to come. The story of Arthur Vance is a reminder that some people don't need to speak loudly, because their life's work has already created an echo that can shake the very foundations of power. Arthur Vance's life was a study in deliberate simplicity, a quiet rebellion against the noise and ambition that had once defined his world. His apartment was on the 3rd floor of a pre-war walk-up, a place with good bones and the kind of settled silence that only comes with age. The 2 rooms were meticulously clean, not in a sterile, obsessive way, but with a deep, abiding sense of order. Sunlight, filtered through the leaves of a sturdy oak outside his window, painted shifting patterns on the worn hardwood floors. His library was not vast, but it was profound. On his shelves, Cicero and Marcus Aurelius stood shoulder to shoulder with modern legal theorists and well-thumbed collections of poetry. There were no plaques on the walls, no framed photographs with smiling politicians, no trophies celebrating past victories. The only hint of a life lived beyond these quiet walls was a single object that sat on his small, uncluttered desk, a fountain pen. It was not a Mont Blanc or a Pelican. It was simple, black, with a steel nib and a faint, almost invisible inscription on the silver band near the cap. To any observer, it was a cheap, functional writing instrument. But to Arthur, it was a totem, a physical manifestation of a promise. He would hold it sometimes, not to write, but simply to feel the cool, familiar weight of it in his hand. The pen was a gift from a federal judge, a man of unimpeachable character, given to him after a grueling, 3-year-long racketeering case that had dismantled one of the most powerful criminal enterprises in the country. The inscription was a single Latin word, incorruptus, untouchable, uncorrupted. That was the man Arthur had been. In the hallowed halls of the Justice Department, they had a name for him, a name whispered with a mixture of awe and fear: the Saint. He was the prosecutor who could not be bought, could not be threatened, could not be swayed. He moved with a quiet, relentless purpose, dismantling empires of greed and corruption not with fire and fury, but with the unassailable logic of the law and an integrity so absolute it was almost a physical force. Then, at the zenith of his career, with the Attorney General's office all but guaranteed, he had simply walked away. He submitted his resignation, packed his office, and vanished from the public eye, leaving behind a legacy that became the stuff of legend among a very small, very powerful circle of people. He chose anonymity because the fight had taken its toll. He had looked into the abyss of human greed for too long and feared it was beginning to look back. He wanted silence. He wanted to read his books, to watch the seasons change through his window, to feel the simple, honest satisfaction of a life lived without complication. His son Leo could never understand this choice. To Leo, his father's retirement was not an act of philosophical self-preservation. It was an act of profound failure, a surrender. He had grown up in the shadow of a great man, but he had only ever seen the shadow, never the light that cast it. He saw the small apartment not as a sanctuary, but as a prison. He saw his father's worn tweed jackets not as a sign of humility, a rejection of materialism, but as a badge of defeat. And in the letters Arthur read, letters that arrived less and less frequently, he saw his son's desperate, frantic climb for the very things he himself had so purposefully renounced. The letters were filled with boasts of new clients, new cars, new connections, all of it brittle and hollow. Arthur would read them, fold them carefully, and place them in a small wooden box, his heart aching with a quiet, paternal grief for a son who was so lost, so desperate to build a life out of scaffolding and veneer. He never judged, he never lectured. He just watched, and he waited, and he hoped his son would one day find his own way back to something solid, something real. He hoped, but he was not optimistic. He knew his son. He knew the hunger that drove him was insatiable, and that one day it would lead him to a place from which there was no easy return. He just never imagined he would be the one to be consumed by it. Leo Vance existed in a world of filters and carefully curated angles. His life was a performance, staged for an audience of anonymous followers on platforms that rewarded illusion over substance. He saw the world not in terms of what was real, but what was marketable. And his father, Arthur Vance, was deeply, profoundly unmarketable. Leo's resentment was a slow-growing poison that had started in his adolescence. He'd hear the whispers about his father, the half-mentioned stories of legendary cases, but he could never reconcile that mythic figure with the quiet, bookish man who sat at home, who seemed to take more pleasure in a well-argued legal brief than in any of the trappings of success. As Leo grew older, this confusion curdled into a kind of contempt. He saw his father's deliberate choice of a simple life not as an act of integrity, but as a personal affront, a deliberate withholding of the status and wealth that should have been Leo's birthright. Why did they have to live in a modest house when the men his father had prosecuted and convicted lived in mansions? Why did his father drive a sensible sedan when he could have had a chauffeured town car? To Leo, it was a cosmic injustice. He wanted the world to know he was the son of Arthur Vance, but he wanted the Arthur Vance of legend, the titan of justice, not this quiet, unassuming man who seemed content to fade into obscurity. This festering resentment became the engine of his ambition. He would show his father what real success looked like. He would build an empire of his own, one made of glass and steel and tangible, envy-inducing assets. He became a high-end real estate broker, a world where perception was everything. He learned the language of leverage and credit, of appearance and influence. And it was there, in the world of high finance, that he stumbled upon the key to his grandest illusion. He discovered the true, untapped power of his father's name. It wasn't in the whispered legends, it was in the cold, hard data of his credit report. It was a perfect score, a flawless financial history stretching back decades. A name that, in the rarefied air of institutional finance, was still a byword for absolute, unimpeachable trustworthiness. The inciting incident was not a single, dramatic moment of decision, but a slow, insidious slide. It began with a house, a monument to his own ego. It was a starkly modern structure of glass and white concrete cantilevered over a canyon, with an infinity pool that seemed to spill into the horizon. It cost $770,000, a sum so far beyond his actual means it was laughable. But he had to have it. It was the ultimate prop for the life he was pretending to live. His first few loan applications were rejected, his own income and credit history deemed insufficient. The rejection was a humiliation, a confirmation of his own inadequacy. And that's when the dark thought took root. His father's name. His father's credit. It was just sitting there dormant and used. A tool left to rust in a shed. What was the harm? He would make the payments. He would flip the house in a year or two for a massive profit. He would pay off the loan, and his father would never even have to know. He was just borrowing the name, just for a little while. The act itself was shockingly simple in the digital age. With the help of a mortgage broker who specialized in creative financing, he procured the necessary documents. A digital signature, a forged power of attorney, a few cleverly worded emails from a spoofed address. The bank, Sterling Fiduciary, saw the application come across their desk. The name, Arthur Vance, set off a green light in their system. They saw the legendary credit score. They saw the decades of financial stability. The loan officer, a man who had heard the old stories, even made a note in the file. Applicant is the Arthur Vance. Rock solid. Expedite approval. The loan was approved in less than a week. Leo felt a surge of triumphant, godlike power. He had done it. He had bent the world to his will. He stood on the balcony of his new glass house, looking out at the city lights, and he felt not a shred of guilt. He felt only vindication. He had finally taken what was rightfully his. The first notice from Sterling Fiduciary Bank arrived in a crisp, unassuming envelope. It was polite, almost deferential, a gentle reminder of a missed payment. Leo tossed it, unopened, onto a marble countertop cluttered with champagne corks and invitations to gallery openings he had no intention of attending. The second notice, a month later, was firmer, the language less accommodating. He ignored that one too. The real estate market, which he had counted on for a quick and profitable flip, had cooled unexpectedly. His commissions had dried up. The lavish lifestyle he was funding was a voracious beast, and the massive mortgage payment was a monthly guillotine. The panic began as a low thrum of anxiety, a background static to his carefully curated life, but soon it grew into a screaming crescendo. Then came the certified letter. The words on the page were cold and clinical, notice of intent to foreclose. The paper felt like ice in his hands. His world, the beautiful, fragile illusion he had constructed, was about to shatter. His first instinct was not shame. It was not remorse. It was a white-hot surge of indignant fury. How could this be happening to him? And in that moment of pure, narcissistic panic, he did not see his own recklessness, his own deceit. He saw only one person to blame, the man whose name was on the loan. He picked up his phone and stabbed at the screen, his hands shaking. Arthur answered on the second ring, his voice calm and steady as always. "Leo, is everything all right?" Leo didn't bother with pleasantries. The words erupted from him, a torrent of accusation. "All right? Nothing is all right. The bank, they're foreclosing. On the house. What did you do? I thought you had this handled. Your finances, your accounts, what the hell happened?" On the other end of the line, Arthur was silent for a long moment. He could hear the frantic, wheezing breaths of his son. He knew this call was coming. He had known it from the moment Leo had first mentioned a new investment. "I see," Arthur said finally, his voice devoid of any emotion. "They are foreclosing." "Yes, they're foreclosing," Leo shrieked. "You need to fix this. Call them. Do something. This is your name on the line. Your reputation." It was at that moment, in the cold, sterile offices of the bank's retained law firm, that a young paralegal named Maya Singh first opened the file designated Vance, Leo J. ETAL. She was sharp, ambitious, and possessed a preternatural eye for detail. The first thing she noticed was the discrepancy. The loan was for a multi-million-dollar property, yet the primary signatory, Arthur Vance, listed his address as a small rental apartment in a modest neighborhood. The loan had been approved with unusual speed, with a note from the original officer simply saying, "Name is legendary. No further verification needed." Legendary? She'd never heard of him. She ran a standard public records search on Arthur Vance. There was almost nothing. No social media, no news articles, no corporate directorships. Just a voter registration, a driver's license, and a pension from the Department of Justice. It was the profile of a ghost. Then she was asked to sit in on a preliminary meeting. Leo Vance strode in, all bluster and expensive cologne, immediately launching into a tirade of blame and deflection. And behind him, his father, Arthur, entered the room. Maya watched him. He was neat, his clothes were worn but clean, and he moved with a quiet economy of motion. He sat down, and as his son raged, he simply listened. He didn't flinch. He didn't argue. His gaze was calm, analytical. Maya had seen hundreds of people in this situation. She had seen fear, anger, denial, pleading. She had never seen this. This was not the behavior of a man on the verge of financial ruin. It was the behavior of a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. Her eyes narrowed. She noticed the way he sat, perfectly still, his posture erect. She saw his hands, resting calmly on his knees. And she saw, just for a moment, him reach into his jacket pocket and touch something, a small, reassuring gesture that seemed to anchor him in the storm of his son's making. The file didn't make sense. The son didn't make sense. And the father made no sense at all. Maya Singh made a note on her legal pad, a single, underlined question. Who is Arthur Vance? The open loop had been created, not just for her, but for the entire narrative. A quiet man sat in the heart of a maelstrom, and a young paralegal was the first to realize he wasn't the victim. He was the eye of the storm. The pressure from Sterling Fiduciary Bank intensified, transitioning from formal notices to aggressive legal maneuvering. They arranged a formal deposition in a glass-walled conference room on the 47th floor of the bank's downtown tower, a space designed to intimidate. The view of the sprawling city was meant to remind all who entered of the bank's power, its permanence. The bank's lead counsel, Henderson, sat at the head of the table, flanked by two junior lawyers who arranged their files with meticulous, almost surgical precision. He exuded an aura of expensive, predatory confidence. Leo was already there when Arthur arrived, pacing nervously by the window, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in low, urgent tones. He barely acknowledged his father's entrance. Arthur took a seat, his back to the panoramic view, and placed his hands on the table. He was a small island of stillness in his son's churning sea of anxiety. Henderson began, his voice smooth and laced with condescension. "Mr. Vance," he said, addressing Arthur directly, ignoring Leo for the moment. "Let's be frank. The paper trail on this loan is problematic. Your signature is present. Your credit history was the sole basis for this extension of capital. Yet, your son was the sole occupant and, it would appear, the sole beneficiary of the funds. Now, you're claiming you had no knowledge of this transaction." Arthur met his gaze. "That is correct." Henderson leaned forward, a theatrical gesture of feigned intimacy. "Your son, however," he said, letting the words hang in the air as he glanced at Leo, "has provided a statement suggesting a verbal agreement, a family arrangement. He claims you were a willing, if silent, partner in this investment. An investment that has, regrettably, soured." He looked back at Arthur, his eyes narrowing. "So which is it? Were you a knowing participant in a high-risk venture that failed? Or were you so negligent in the management of your own affairs that your son was able to fraudulently secure a loan of nearly $1 million without your knowledge? Frankly, one scenario suggests complicity, the other incompetence. Neither is a particularly good look." Leo, who had finished his call, shifted in his chair. This was his chance to defend his father, to confess, to take responsibility. He could have ended it right there. But the crushing weight of the consequences was too much to bear. He remained silent. He looked down at the table, a coward in a $1,000 suit, and by his silence, he became Henderson's accomplice. He let his father absorb the full force of the attack. Arthur's face remained a mask of calm neutrality. He did not look at his son. He did not react to Henderson's provocations. "I understand your position," was all he said, his voice level. In the corner of the room, taking meticulous notes, sat Maya Singh. She watched the exchange with a growing sense of outrage. She saw Leo's cowardice, Henderson's smug cruelty, and Arthur's incredible, almost inhuman composure. She found herself focusing on Arthur's hands. They had not moved. They were steady, relaxed. Her gaze drifted to his jacket. The pocket was slightly weighted, and she saw the glint of a simple, metal clip. The pen. He hadn't touched it this time. It was as if he didn't need its reassurance. He was drawing strength from some deeper, internal well. Henderson, emboldened by Arthur's passivity, pushed harder. "I'm going to need a more substantive answer, sir. We are preparing to file a suit that will not only result in the seizure of the property, but will also seek damages. We will argue that you and your son acted in concert to defraud this institution. Your reputation, what little of it you have left, will be eviscerated in the public record." The threat was naked, brutal. The junior lawyers smirked. Leo sank lower in his chair, a portrait of pathetic self-pity. Arthur took a slow, deliberate breath. He looked directly at Henderson, and for the first time, A flicker of something ancient and powerful stirred in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It was something heavier. It was pity. "You may proceed as you see fit," he said. The simplicity and finality of the statement seemed to momentarily wrong-foot Henderson. He had expected pleading, excuses, anger. He had not expected serene, almost dismissive acceptance. The meeting ended shortly after. As they filed out, Leo brushed past his father without a word. Arthur paused, waiting for the elevator, a solitary figure in the cavernous, opulent lobby. Maya, gathering her files, watched him. She saw the quiet dignity, the unbent spine, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Henderson had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He had mistaken a sleeping lion for a house cat, and he was about to learn the difference. The final meeting was set not in a courtroom, but in the bank's main boardroom, a chamber reserved for the most significant corporate decisions. It was a room designed to consecrate power, with a 20-foot-long table carved from a single piece of dark African bubinga wood. The walls were lined with muted gray silk, and the air was chilled to a precise 68 degrees. It was the financial equivalent of a high altar, and a sacrifice was about to be made. Arthur and Leo were seated on one side, facing Henderson and the bank's entire senior legal team. The bank's chief financial officer, a severe-looking woman named Evelyn Reed, presided from the head of the table. She was here to personally sign off on the litigation, a formality that signaled the gravity of the bank's position. Henderson was in his element, delivering his final summary with the polished cadence of a seasoned executioner. He painted a damning portrait of the Van Cess, weaving a narrative of familial greed and reckless deceit. He portrayed Leo as the foolish frontman and Arthur as the disgraced, complicit enabler. "And so," Henderson concluded, his voice resonating with righteous finality, "it is with regret, but with a firm commitment to our fiduciary duty, that we recommend pursuing full legal action against both Leo Vance and his father, Arthur Vance. The evidence of a coordinated effort to defraud this institution is, in our view, overwhelming." Evelyn Reed nodded slowly, her expression grim. She picked up a pen, a heavy, silver instrument, preparing to authorize the proceedings. Leo's face was ashen. He stared at the polished surface of the table, watching his reflection warp and distort. He was ruined. His father was ruined. And it was all his fault. Arthur, however, remained as he had been from the very beginning, still. He wasn't looking at Henderson or the CFO. He was looking at the double doors at the far end of the boardroom, as if expecting a guest. In that moment, as the CFO's pen hovered over the document, the boardroom doors swung open. They didn't crash or bang. They opened with a smooth, expensive, almost silent swing, propelled by an unseen hand. Every head in the room turned. Standing in the doorway was a man who commanded attention without demanding it. He was tall, in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair and a face that seemed etched with the weight of immense responsibility. He wore a bespoke suit of such quiet perfection that it made every other suit in the room look like a cheap imitation. He was flanked by two aides, a man and a woman, who stood back with the respectful deference of acolytes. The effect of his arrival was instantaneous and absolute. A wave of shock and disbelief washed over the bank's legal team. Henderson's jaw literally dropped, his face draining of all its smug color. Evelyn Reed, the powerful CFO, froze with her pen in the air, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. The very atmosphere in the room had changed. The air grew thick, heavy, charged with a new and terrifying authority. The man was Marcus Thorne. He was not just on the board of directors. He was not just the chairman. He was the founder and CEO of the entire global banking corporation, of which Sterling Fiduciary was but a small, regional subsidiary. He was a legend in the world of finance, a titan whose presence in this room was as likely as a lightning strike. Thorne's gaze, sharp and impossibly blue, swept across the room, taking in the scene with a swift, analytical glance. He ignored his own shell-shocked legal team. He ignored the CFO. His eyes landed on Leo, and a flicker of profound disappointment crossed his features. Then his gaze moved to the end of the table. It rested on the quiet, unassuming old man in the worn tweed jacket, and the expression on the face of one of the most powerful men in the world transformed. The cold authority vanished, replaced by something else entirely, something that no one in that room had ever seen him display, a look of deep, profound, and almost painful reverence. Marcus Thorne walked into the boardroom, and it felt as if the gravitational pull of the room had shifted to center on him. His footsteps on the thick, plush carpet were the only sound in the sudden, tomb-like silence. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his eyes never leaving the quiet figure of Arthur Vance. He walked past his own senior counsel, Henderson, who seemed to shrink in his chair, becoming smaller and less significant with every step Thorne took. He passed the chief financial officer, Evelyn Reed, who had managed to lower her pen, but still looked as if she had seen a ghost. He stopped, not at the head of the table, but directly beside the chair where Arthur sat. He stood there for a moment, simply looking at the older man. The silence stretched, becoming unbearable for everyone except the two men who were its focus. Finally, Thorne turned his head, his gaze falling upon Henderson with the force of a physical blow. "Mr. Henderson," he said. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a quality of such absolute command that it cut through the silence like a surgeon's scalpel. "Explain to me what is happening in this room. Explain to me why my morning was interrupted by an urgent call from my head of security, informing me that a man to whom I owe my entire career was being subjected to a kangaroo court by my own legal department." Henderson opened his mouth, but only a dry, croaking sound came out. He looked to Evelyn Reed for help, but she was staring at her hands, her face a mask of horrified realization. Thorne held up a hand, a gesture that was both a dismissal and a command for silence. "No. Allow me," he said, his voice dropping slightly, taking on a new, reverent tone. He turned to address the entire room, but his focus was still on Arthur. "You people, you look at this man, and you see an easy target. You see a defaulted loan, a liability. You see an old man in a threadbare suit, and you smell blood in the water. Your hubris, your willful ignorance, is staggering." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Leo, for the first time, looked up from the table, his face a canvas of utter confusion. 25 years ago, Thorne began, his voice now a powerful, resonant baritone, the voice of a storyteller at a king's court. "I was a young, ambitious executive at another institution. I made a mistake, a serious one. I trusted the wrong people, and I found myself at the center of a massive federal investigation into securities fraud. My life was over. My career, my reputation, everything was about to be turned to ash." He gestured with his chin toward Arthur. This was the man leading the investigation, the United States Assistant Attorney for this district, a man they called the Saint. Not because he was soft, because he was incorruptible. He was the most feared prosecutor in the country. He dismantled a dozen fortunes bigger than mine. He sent men who were considered gods to federal prison. And he had me cold. He had enough to indict, to convict, to destroy me. Thorne's eyes took on a distant look, remembering. But he did something no one else would have done. He kept digging. He wasn't interested in a quick, high-profile conviction. He was interested in the truth. He worked for a year, sifting through mountains of evidence, and in the end, he did not indict me. He proved my innocence. He proved I was a pawn, not a player. He saved me. And when it was all over, he asked for nothing. No favors. No public acknowledgement. He simply closed the file and moved on to the next dragon he had to slay. He then looked directly at Leo. "You have no idea who your father is. You see a quiet old man. I see the titan who single-handedly reformed the financial laws in this state. You see a small apartment. I see a man who voluntarily walked away from more power and influence than you can possibly imagine, because he valued his soul more than a seat at the table." He then pointed to the worn jacket pocket. "And that penny carries? You probably think it's worthless. That's a gift from federal judge Annabelle Harrison, given to him after he won the landmark RICO case against the entire Port Authority corruption ring. The inscription on it says incorruptus, uncorrupted. It is not a pen. It is a symbol of a creed that men like you, Mr. Henderson, and you," he said, his voice dripping with contempt as he looked at his own CFO, "would not and could not ever understand." The monologue was complete. The reveal was absolute. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been utterly and irrevocably annihilated. Arthur Vance's identity, his secret history of quiet, earth-shaking valor, had been laid bare, and the shame in the room was so thick it was hard to breathe. The silence that followed Marcus Thorne's monologue was different from the one that had preceded his arrival. The first had been a silence of tension and anticipation. This was a silence of profound, crushing shame. It was the sound of arrogance being reduced to dust. Henderson's face, once a mask of smug superiority, was now slack-jawed, his complexion a sickly, mottled gray. He looked at Arthur Vance not as a target, but as a ghost from a history he had been too ignorant to learn, a living legend he had just tried to bully. Evelyn Reed, the CFO, had her eyes closed, as if the sight of the quiet old man was now a physical torment. She, more than anyone, understood the magnitude of the disaster. For a bank whose entire brand was built on prudence and wisdom, to have so grievously, so publicly misjudged and insulted a man like Arthur Vance was an existential threat. Thorne let the silence hang for a long, punishing moment before he spoke again, his voice now returning to the cold, sharp instrument of command. He turned to his legal team. "This meeting is over," he stated flatly. "The Vance loan, file number 774-B, is to be considered nullified. It was the result of a catastrophic internal failure in our due diligence and a profound lack of judgment. It will be expunged from our records. A formal, written apology, drafted by me personally, will be delivered to Mr. Vance's residence this afternoon. Furthermore, a significant sum will be offered as restitution for the distress we have caused. Is that understood?" Henderson and the other lawyers nodded dumbly, their heads bobbing like marionettes with their strings cut. Thorne wasn't finished. He turned his glacial gaze upon Leo, who had shrunk so far into his chair he seemed to be physically dissolving. Thorne's voice dropped to a low, dangerous growl. "And as for you," he said, the words precise and dripping with ice, "you carry the name of a great man. A name you clearly do not understand, and certainly do not deserve. You used his honor as a key to open a door you had no right to walk through. You will leave this building. You will transfer the deed of the house to the bank. And then you and I are going to have a very long, very detailed conversation about your future. You will find that I am not as forgiving as your father." The threat was not of legal action. It was something far more personal, and for Leo, far more terrifying. It was the threat of being held accountable by a man who understood the true value of the legacy he had squandered. Finally, Thorne turned back to Arthur. All the coldness, all the authority melted away. His posture softened, and he inclined his head in a gesture of utmost respect. "Arthur," he said, his voice filled with a genuine, heartfelt warmth, "it is an honor to see you, sir. I am deeply, profoundly sorry that it was under these disgraceful circumstances." For the first time since entering the room, Arthur moved. He blinked slowly, as if returning from a great distance. He looked at Thorne, and the faintest hint of a smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was not a smile of triumph, but of simple acknowledgement. He offered a single, small nod. It was enough. The gesture was a quiet absolution, a sign that the matter, for him, was closed. The honor of Arthur Vance, which had never truly been lost, was now restored in the eyes of all who were present. The scales had been balanced, not by a shout, but by the quiet weight of truth. Vindication did not change Arthur Vance. He did not puff out his chest or cast a triumphant glance at his humbled adversaries. The dramatic restoration of his honor was, to him, merely a correction of a clerical error in the universe, a brief and tiresome deviation from his preferred state of quiet anonymity. He pushed his chair back from the great mahogany table, the sound of the wood scraping against the floor a stark punctuation in the room's thick silence. He stood up. He did not look at Henderson or the other lawyers, who were now diligently avoiding his gaze, staring at their notepads as if they contained the secrets of salvation. He did not look at his son, who remained a crumpled figure of shame, his face buried in his hands. Arthur simply turned and began to walk toward the boardroom doors. His pace was unhurried, his posture as straight and dignified as it had been when he entered. He was simply leaving, the affair concluded, his part in the drama finished. Marcus Thorne, a man who commanded armies of financiers and moved global markets with a single phone call, took a half-step forward, his expression one of almost boyish concern. "Arthur, wait," he said, his voice softer now. "Is there anything we can do? Anything at all? A car? A settlement? Name it." Arthur paused at the threshold of the room, his back still to everyone. The light from the hallway silhouetted his slender frame. He stood there for a moment, and the entire room held its breath, waiting for his response. Would he ask for money? An apology tour? Would he finally demand the recognition he was due? When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, yet it carried with perfect clarity to every corner of the silent room. "The boy," he said, and it was clear he meant his son, Leo. "He needs to learn." That was all. No anger, no demand for punishment, just a simple, profound diagnosis and the implied prescription. Let the consequences be his teacher. With that, he stepped out of the boardroom and was gone. The narrator's voice returns, filled with a reflective, reverent quality. And so the quiet hero departed, leaving in his wake not destruction but clarity. He didn't need the grand gestures of vindication. He didn't need the fawning apologies of powerful men. His honor was not something that could be given or taken away by others. It was an internal state, a fortress built stone by stone over a lifetime of quiet, correct choices. He returned to his small, third-floor apartment, to the sunlight filtering through the oak leaves, to his books and his silence. The world outside had been shaken, but his world remained unchanged. For Leo, however, everything had changed. He was left alone in the vast, empty boardroom, the weight of his father's quiet final words pressing down on him more heavily than any legal judgment ever could. He needs to learn. It was not a curse, but a charge, a burden he would have to carry. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, and saw his own distorted reflection in the polished table. He finally saw himself for what he was, a hollow man who had tried to steal the light of a star, only to be burned by its quiet, immense gravity. His father had not destroyed him. He had simply stepped aside and allowed Leo to be confronted by the full, crushing weight of his own character. It was not an ending. For Leo, it was a terrifying, necessary beginning. The long, hard road to understanding the legacy he had so casually betrayed was just starting. Arthur had given him one last, painful gift, the chance to learn. In a world that shouts, that clamors for attention, that measures worth in followers and likes and the square footage of a home, Arthur Vance was a whisper. He was a quiet testament to a forgotten truth, that a man's real value is not in what he accumulates, but in what he refuses to sacrifice. The events in that boardroom were not a victory for Arthur. He was never at war. They were a lesson for everyone else. He taught the powerful a lesson about humility, reminding them that the greatest authority often resides in the quietest man in the room. He taught the arrogant a lesson about ignorance, proving that judging a book by its worn, unassuming cover can lead to catastrophic miscalculation. And he taught his son the most painful and important lesson of all, that character is the one currency you cannot forge, you cannot borrow, and you cannot steal. Honor is not a performance. Integrity does not require an audience. It is what you are when no one is watching. Arthur Vance returned to his life, a life that others saw as small, but which he knew to be immeasurably vast, filled with the richness of thought, the companionship of great minds from centuries past, and the profound peace that comes from living in alignment with one's own deepest principles. He sought no reward, no applause. His reward was his own quiet conscience, the unassailable fortress of his own soul. The echo of that day in the boardroom would ripple outwards, a cautionary tale whispered in the halls of power, a modern fable about the old lion who reminded the jackals what true strength looked like. But for Arthur, it was just another day, another chapter in a life lived with deliberate, unshakable purpose. He had faced down titans of industry, criminal masterminds, and the insidious temptations of power, but his greatest, most enduring battle was the daily, quiet one, the choice to remain true to himself. And in that battle, he was, and always had been, undefeated. The story closes with a direct address from the narrator, a final call to reflection and engagement. We live in a society that often confuses net worth with self-worth. We see the curated illusions of success and can feel diminished by our own, more ordinary lives. But the story of Arthur Vance reminds us that the true measure of a person's character is not what is visible to the world. It is the invisible architecture of their integrity, the silent choices they make, the honor they carry not as a badge, but as their very backbone. We've all encountered people who judge others based on appearances. What do you believe is the truest measure of a person's worth? Is it their achievements, their kindness, their resilience? Share your thoughts with our community in the comments below. And if this story moved you, if you believe that quiet heroes walk among us every single day, then please subscribe to Moral Compass Stories and ring that notification bell. Join us as we continue to seek out and share more stories that matter. Because in a world of noise, it is the whispers of integrity that we need to hear the most. Subscribe to Justin's Stories for more stories like this.